Hello students, welcome back to my class. Today we are going to study one of the letters, Franz Kafka's letter to his father. So, Franz Kafka, as you know, was a prominent novelist of early 20th century. He wrote several novels and at the same time he was also an epistolary artist who wrote hundreds of letters to his different family members. And one of his most famous letters is his letter to the father, but which was actually not delivered to his father, but it became a monumental creative text of Kafka that blends all his essential characteristics as a writer. As we find in his novels, the fine blend of realism and fantasy, or what we can say sometimes magic realism, and his penchant for creating the essential identity of individual through this presentation is also very much evident in this letter. This letter is particularly can be categorized as a multi-generic text because in spite of being a letter, it is also as good as a family chronology, or it can be treated as an autobiographical text where the writer is very thoroughly noting down his struggles from the childhood till the time of his writing this letter, both in his family and as an individual within himself. So, this letter remains one of the most historic document, or the document about Kafka as a person, as a writer. And today we are going to discuss about this letter, and this letter is quite lengthy. So, we will be very briefly touching about his various important revelations about his own life, his personality, his lamentations, his lackings, so on and so forth. So, at the beginning of this letter, he is telling, "Dearest father, you asked me recently why I maintain that I am afraid of you. As usual, I was unable to think of any answer to your question, partly for the very reason that I am afraid of you, and partly because an explanation on the grounds of this fear would mean going into far more details than I could." So, in this letter, he is trying to answer one of his father's accusations that why he was keeping away from him, or why he seems to be very much afraid of his father. And he is elaborating. The letter is also, with its simple rendering of the thoughts of the writer, is bringing out the inner psychology to the fore, and thus it is providing a fine platform for the reader and the critics to critically analyze Kafka as a writer as well as Kafka as a person. So he is telling that you do charge me with coldness, estrangement, and ingratitude. And what is more, you charge me with it in such a way as to make it seem my fault, as though I might have been able with something like a touch on steering wheel to make everything quite different. So at the beginning of the letter, he is only talking about his father's accusation, that how he accused him of being cold, estranged, ungrateful, so on and so forth. But then he is trying to answer in a very systematic manner, but at sometimes we find with his calculated answers, he is also being swayed by the emotion. So he is telling that now, Father, on the whole, I have never doubted your goodness towards me, but this remark I consider wrong. You can't pretend that is true, but merely for the reason to maintain that other fathers pretend is either more opinionatedness. So he is telling that being a father, you are accusing me of being cold, ungrateful, and all that. Can it be considered as your opinion or is it the reality? Only as a father, you have been too strong to me, particularly since my brothers died when they were small and my sisters came along only much later, so that I alone had to bear the brunt of it. So he is giving us the idea that how his brothers died early and he was the only male child remained along with his three sisters. And he is telling that it was natural that as the only male child, your focus was particularly on me and your expectations were definitely much greater. Then he is narrating about his father's personality. He is telling that uh, you are perhaps not wholly a Kafka in your general outlook, in so far as I can compare you with Uncle Philip, Ludwig, and Heinrich. He is telling that if I compare you with my three uncles, then I find you are also not having all the characteristics of a Kafka. And that is odd. Here I don't see quite clear either. After all, they were all more cheerful, fresher, more informal, more easygoing, less severe than you. So Franz is accusing his father that you lacked all these positive characteristics of the Kafkas. While my uncles were cheerful, fresh, informal, easygoing, less severe, you were just the opposite. And in any case, we were so different, and in our difference, so dangerous to each other that if anyone has tried to calculate in advance how I, the slowly developing child, and you, the full grown man, would stand to each other, he could have assumed that you would simply trample me underfoot. Then he is making an elaborate comparison between him and his father. He is telling that you were a robust Kafka, a full grown man, very hefty, very strong, having a very loud voice. On the other hand, I was a sickly child and undergrown, and I was simply whimpering. So there cannot be any comparison between you and me. I was a timid child. For all that, I am sure I was also obstinate as children are. So he is confessing that he was timid and also obstinate as a child. And he is telling that his father wanted him to bring up like a Kafka, a very strong, passionate character. There is only one episode, early years of which I have direct memory, and he is going to narrate one of his childhood memory when one night he was whimpering for water. His father felt so disturbed that he took Franz to the balcony and kept him there and locked the door the whole night in the sarts in the cold winter. So he is telling that was the treatment. You were more energetic, wilder, more untrammeled. So he is talking about his father as being more energetic, wilder, and untrammeled. Your methods of bringing up a child and their effects on me had a great effect. Therefore, he is telling that your very method of bringing up the child terrified me because I was a timid child. And you also were a big person physically. The physical difference between him and his father is being narrated when he is talking about both of them going for bathing, and in their body when they were in the public gaze. He is telling how the public would have wondered that they are the unlikely father and son. But at the same time, Franz is talking that actually, as a child, he needed encouragement. He needed the help of his father to conform to the values or to the expectations and ideals of his father. What I would have needed was a little encouragement, a little friendliness, a little keeping open of my road. But these things he lament that his father didn't provide him. And he is accusing his father as a tyrant. For me, you took on the enigmatic quality that all tyrants have, whose rights are based on their person and not on reason. So his father was like a tyrant who only considered everything on a personal note than on any reason. Therefore, he is telling his father was not only a dominating father, both physically and intellectually, but also psychologically. And rather, by virtue of your antagonistic nature, you couldn't help but always and inevitably cause the child such disappointment. So, all the time he was causing him disappointment. And further, this antagonism accumulating material was constantly intensified. Every now and then, his father would have accused him, would have antagonized him, would have terrorized him, or would have made him feel very belittled. Therefore, he is telling, I could not muster courage, resolution, confidence, delight in the experiences of life. And even he is giving one example when his father also talked about his friend by expressing his attitude, which was full of hatred. And but for me as a child, everything you called out to me was positively a heavenly commandment. But at the same time, Franz is telling, whatever you told me, it was like heavenly commandment. I wanted to follow it. I wanted to conform to it. But you didn't exactly do as an ideal father. And he is also giving the example that how his father was giving commandments in each and every aspect of his life. As a child, he was told how to behave on the dining table, but he is telling that it was you who violated your own commandments, and thus my confidence in you, my conviction in you was shattered. He is telling that care had to be taken that no scraps fell on the floor. In the end, it was under your chair that there were the most scraps. So, with the use of irony, Franz is bringing out the self contradiction in the character of his father. And then he's talking about his miserliness. He's telling that in your home as a child, I believed that I was in these three worlds. Hence, the world was for me divided into three parts. One in which I, the slave, lived under laws that had been invented only for me. So, it was one world where he was the slave and his father was the slave master. And the second world where his father was the government and he was the governed, for whom all the laws are created. And the third world where he is finding the relationship between his father and himself was that of where everybody lived happily and free from orders and from having to obey except him, because he was all the time a rebel. So he was a slave, he was a governed person, and he was a rebel. Then he is talking about his father's exerting of domination in different spheres of his life. And he is telling that frightful, hoarse undertone of anger and utter condemnation that makes me tremble less today than in my childhood, only because the child's exclusive sense of guilt has been partly replaced by insight into our helplessness, yours and mine. And he is accusing his father that how he tortured him as a child, that your extremely effective rhetorical methods in bringing me up, which never failed to work with me, were abuse, threats, irony, spiteful laughter, and oddly enough, self pity. So, by all these means, his father made him a confined self within himself, who could never communicate, who could never have that confidence to reach another person, who could express himself freely. And here again was your enigmatic innocence and inviolability. And he's telling that his father was also having the binary of qualities. On one end, he was so much a tyrant, so much a domineering character. On the other hand, he also sometimes behaved as if he was suffering because of this child, which he expressed with innocence and inviolability. You reinforced abusiveness with threats, and this appalled me. How terrible for me was, for instance, that I will tear you apart like a piece. And he's giving one example of his father's anger, his father's words, by telling that you told me I will tear you apart like a piece. So, how could it be? How a father could tell to a child like that? Then he is again elaborating about the relationship between a father and the son, how it should be, how the ideal of a relation should be, and how his father had always violated it. You put special trust in bringing up children by means of irony, and this was the most in keeping with your superiority over me. You always wanted to enforce your superiority over me. And Each question would be accompanied by malicious laughter and a malicious face. And sometimes there was a malicious laughter and a malicious face which he was very much afraid of. And one become a glum, inattentive, disobedient child, always intent on escape, mainly within one's own self. So he's telling, ultimately, I became a child who is glum, inattentive, disobedient, and always intent on escape. And he suffered a great deal for his father, that he is again and again repeating throughout the letter. And thereafter, he is talking about his father sometimes smiling and sometimes telling him to smile, to open up, but he is telling how it could be possible. He is telling that the difference between his father and his mother had also exerted a great influence on his life when he grew up as a child. And very elaborately, he is talking about the difference between the mother side, that is Loi, and his father side, which is Kafka. The Kafkas are very strong, very abusive, very harsh, where the Loi are more sensitive. And he is telling, it is true that the mother was illimitably good to me, but for me, all that was in relation to you. And she was the very prototype of good sense and reasonableness. So he's telling his mother was the prototype of good sense and reasonableness. And most of the time, she came between the father and the son, or the father and the children. And from the both ends, she had to suffer. But still, she could manage that, both in the family as well as in the business of his father. Such an opportunity would first of all have to be created by violence and revolutions. It would have meant breaking away from home. And he's telling that under your rule in the house, there only one thing can be possible, that one should break away from this sense of home, this sense of togetherness or relationship, because this relationship is always based on violence and revolutions. You termed ingratitude, extravagance, disobedience, treachery, madness. These are the allegations of his father against Franz. Ingratitude, extravagance, disobedience, treachery, and madness. But at the same time, he is talking about his sisters, and he is telling that between his three sisters, Bhali, Eli, and Otla or Otli. So, Bhali, being closest to mother, she fell in with your wishes in a similar way. She was more like the mother of Franz, and in one way, the father had a better relationship with her. But Eli, on the other hand, was clumsy, tired, timid, bad tempered, guilt ridden, over meek, malicious, lazy, greedy, miserly child. And she had some contrast with her father, but she went to marry, and after her marriage, she changed. She left home, married, had children, and became cheerful, carefree, brave, generous, unselfish, and hopeful. So she had changed for all the better after the marriage. And Franz is accusing his father that the father didn't mark the change in Eli. That means Franz is trying to say that when Ellie was there at home, she was a different child because of her father's treatment, her father's temperament. But when she got married, she became a different woman, quite opposite. Therefore, Franz is accusing his father that he was more dominating, more harsh, more violent, and which also had its impact on the girl he first fell in love with, Gertie. And then he is talking about his third sister, Otla, who is the most rebellious character in the family, but who is a fine blend of the Louis and Kafka. At any rate, here was something like a kind of Louis equipped with the best Kafka weapons. So Kafka's power and vigor was there with Otla, and she was having the sensibility of Louis, or the doggedness, the determination of the Louis. I was soon finished of what remained was flight, embitterment, melancholy, and inner struggle. But you two were always in a fighting position, always fresh, always energetic. Otla is even today perhaps the purest representation of the marriage between you and mother and of the forces it combined. She is having Louis defiance, touchiness, sense of justice, restlessness, and all that backed by the consciousness of the Kafka vigor. So Franz is praising Otla, what he couldn't do against his father, what he couldn't do to escape his father, Otla could do. Therefore, he is having all the praise for Otla. But then she is making further comparison. She is talking about Irma, his niece, whom his father appreciated, as well as Robert, who was also appreciated by his father, but he is telling that they had never the impact of his father. They grew outside the influence of his father, and when they entered into the business along with his father, they were already matured. Therefore, they didn't suffer what Franz had to suffer. And in the later, he is going on to elaborate about the sense of mistrust created between him and his father. And he is telling that when he grew up in the matters of education, his father was also a domineering character and who wanted to impose the ideas and things on Franz. As a result, Franz could not attain what he should have attended. And then he tried his hand in Judaism. I found just as little escape from you in Judaism, in religion, because Franz Kafka belongs to Judaism. So he wanted to escape from his father's influence through religion. But there he found, as a child, his father as more a ritualistic practitioner of Judaism and a hypocrite. Sometimes he goes to the synagogue, sometimes he doesn't go. Sometimes he observes certain festivals, sometimes he doesn't. Sometimes he himself violates. So, the character of the father is having the binary, therefore, he is telling that in the matters of religion also, he could not imbibe any good values from his father. Therefore, he is accusing his father by telling, you really had brought some traces of Judaism with you from the ghetto like village community. So, he is telling your idea of Judaism is like some ghetto like village community. It is not a sound religious practice or experience on your part, which you could have imparted to me or from which I could have imbibed. So he is telling that the few flimsy gestures you performed in the name of Judaism and with an indifference in keeping with their flimsiness could have any higher meaning. For you, they had meaning as little souvenirs of earlier times. And that was why you wanted to pass them on to me. But since they no longer had any intrinsic value, even for you, you could do this only through persuasion of threat. So you could made me religious only by threat, not by any ideal persuasion. Had your Judaism been stronger, your example would have been more compelling. And after the religion, he is coming back again in the letter to request his father that how, as a child, he wanted something more from his father. My writing was all about you. All I did there, after all, was to bemoan what I couldn't bemoan upon your breast. It was an intentionally long and drawn out leave taking from you. So, actually, he is telling that really he loved his father as a child. He expected something more from his father. But his father didn't allow him to grow up as a sensible human being. And in the matters of marriage, he's again accusing his father of destroying his ideal concept of a marriage as a young man. My valuation of myself was much more dependent on you than on anything else, such as some external success. That was something for a moment, nothing more. But on the other side, your weight always dragged me down more strongly. This didn't produce any confidence, however. On the contrary, I was always convinced that I cannot match you. I cannot achieve what you expected from me as a Kafka. He is talking about himself joining a gymnasium, and which was again being not fully appreciated by his father, and how he left that. He is also writing in this letter about his writing career, that how he offered his father his explanations about the accusations. After discussing about his physical, intellectual, and the religious differences with his father, when he comes to the topic of marriage and marriage as an escape from his father, it says that in reality, however, the marriage plans turned out to be the most grandiose and hopeful attempts at escape, and consequently their failure was correspondingly grandiose. So he had a great idea about marriage. He had an ideal about married life, family. But he says that as the idea was of grandiose, so the failure was also grandiose. The weakness, the lack of self-confidence, the sense of guilt, and they positively drew a cordon between myself and marriage. So between his personality and the marriage, somewhere, all these lackings created a hurdle for him. And about the marriage, he had that idea: marrying, founding a family, accepting all the children that come, supporting them in this insecure world, and perhaps even guiding them a little, is, I am convinced, the utmost a human being can succeed in doing at all. So, Franz had a great dream of having an ideal family where there will be great relationship between father and son. So, this letter, as a letter of the son to the father, is analyzing the father-son relationship from two different angles. One, from his own relationship with his father, which he is most dissatisfied about, and the ideal that he wanted from his marriage and from his children. But that marriage, that ideal marriage, he couldn't realize in his life because his father had some different attitude towards it. He never believed in his son's ability to fall in love or to marry a girl of his choice as a good one. You wanted to see to it that I shouldn't bring any of the physical field home with me as unimportant. So he is telling that his father considered his relationship with a girl or a woman as physical filth. My choice of a girl meant nothing at all to you. And you had always suppressed my power of decision and now believed that you knew what it was worth. You considered me as timid, hesitant, suspicious, can decide to marry in a flash, as if Franz didn't have his own wisdom, his own self confidence or consideration. So, out of delight over a blouse. Look at the language. The language that Franz is using in this letter is bringing out his utter frustration, and at the same time, it brings the anguish as well as the ideal that he cherished for. And as a result, he couldn't marry. 2 times he made attempt, but both the attempts resulted in grand failure, and he couldn't develop a family. So he is expressing his regret in this letter that he couldn't produce a child with whom he could have shared, whom he could have developed what he lacked in his life. So his lackings in life remained unfulfilled. It could not be fulfilled by his own endeavor. And he is elaborating that by telling that, first of all, achieved enough by your sincerity. His father wanted that he should achieve something by his own sincerity and he should not be guilty. Secondly, that ought to be enough for you now, but it is still not enough. Had to live entirely of me. His father always considered him to be like a parasite, but he's repudiating that allegation. And finally, he is telling that he has answered to all the allegations of his father, and he is completely rejecting his father's allegation, but at the same time, he is also justifying his father's description of him as a timid, gloomy, rebellious child, and he is elaborating why he became like that. But with the correction made by this rejoinder, a correction I neither can nor will elaborate in detail. He is telling, but by writing this letter, he brings to rest the bitterness between him and his father. He is able to explain all these things to his father, and probably his father will now realize why he became like that. And it will take out the bitterness between the two before their death. So the purpose of this letter is not only to answer his father, but also to self-express his feeling for the father, his intense love, his expectation from his father, and at the same time, how he has been frustrated, how he had been neglected, all these things he had expressed. So this letter is an epistolary art where we find the intensity of the feelings, both love and hatred within the writer. And at the same time, it is also narrating in a comparative mode, one after another, all the family members. It is a family chronicle. And if we look at the style of the letter is a very systematic manner going through the whole history of the family, developing the characters through his description. So we can say it is an excellent character writing where his three sisters, the brother in law, the niece, the cousins, the uncles, all, and particularly the character of his father is coming very vividly. It is one of the best character portrayal in the hands of Franz Kafka. And the language that he has used, sometimes we come across very lengthy sentences, but these sentences are reflective of his feelings, his emotions, which are in a troubled state. It is a troubled mind that is being expressed through this language. So, use of irony, use of humor, even the most pungent humor is being exhibited here. So many anecdotes, so many recountings from the life, which are very vital, opening to reveal the characters. So we can say that this is an excellent letter which gives us the perception to Kafka's personal life and his artistic characteristics. And from this, we can encounter questions like Kafka's language, style, and use of literary devices that is used in this letter, or how Kafka made use of the epistolary mode for the purpose of character portrayal. That is more important. So, these two questions we can very well answer if we look it at in a systematic manner as an excellent prose piece from Kafka. I hope you people will do justice to it in your exam. Thank you.